Well, hello to you all once again. Another warm welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV here on YouTube, where we endeavour to bring you more of those long lost classics from a way back in the day. And we're going to go back again to our current series of taking a look through the Terry Pickering classic motorcycle collection. And in this next video, we've got another superb example from Terry's museum of classic off-road bikes. So let's just dive straight into that video now and take a look at Terry's 1981 250 Italian Cagiva. Right, so as I said, we're continuing with our series of looking at the latest batch of vintage off-roaders that are all part of the vast Terry Pickering off-road collection, of which, as you've already seen in the past, are many, and we've visited Terry's superb compendium of old classics on numerous occasions in the past. And this latest bike that we're going to take a look at is some of the recent additions to his museum of rare and unique motorcycles. Although when you take a look at Terry's warehouse of old dirt bike frames and engines, tanks and other rare motorcycle parts, you can see that he's certainly got enough projects lined up to keep him busy for at least the next 20 years or so. So thankfully Classic Dirt Bike TV has now got enough material to keep the channel afloat for some years to come. And all of these skeletons of old dirt bikes will eventually turn into as good as brand new machines once again, once Terry's worked his magic and refurbished or restored them to their once former glory, where they'll all, of course, end up in Terry's collection of rare and iconic vintage motorcycles, a collection that's fast becoming one of the best here in the UK and possibly even in Europe as well. And with Terry adding more and more classics to his assortment on a regular basis, it actually makes you wonder where he's going to put them all, because you can imagine having all of these nice toys to play with each and every day must be a bit of a bind. But anyhow, getting back to our current machine from Terry's Museum of Rare Bikes, this 1981 RX250 Italian Cagiva Enduro racer is yet another of his excellent restorations, which Terry told me that this bike here did take him some time to locate replacement parts that were needed to complete the machine, although as you can see, Terry's hard work and perseverance appears to have paid off once again, because yet another vintage classic is now able to take its pride of place among the rest of his unique species in Terry's lineup. And so the background of this particular build here is that this machine was actually advertised for sale on a well-known internet auction site, and when Terry had a quick look at the pictures that accompanied the ad, it certainly looked like it could be a half decent machine, which on the face of it appeared to be fully intact, but it maybe needed a little bit of recommissioning and maybe some TLC, which wasn't going to be a bit of a problem for the likes of Terry, because he could see that after some hard work, this bike could then be a nice addition to his collection. So eventually he paid for the bike in full and then rubbed his hands in anticipation as he waited on the bike being delivered to his home address. Although when the Italian Cagiva eventually turned up, rather than it being a fully built motorcycle that was on its wheels, this is just how the bike turned up at Terry's doorstep. Not, of course, as seen in the pictures, but a completely dismantled bunch of Cagiva parts, which not only had loads of parts missing that weren't even mentioned in the description. The remaining bits and pieces were all thrown together and placed on this wooden pallet. So, as you'd expect, Terry wasn't best pleased, especially as things like the forks that came with the bike were already broken at the axle mount. So these parts were more or less just pieces of metal junk, as it wouldn't be safe to even contemplate welding these parts back together. But after a long drawn-out inspection of exactly what was left of our so-called Cagiva, it was quite evident that the goods weren't as they were described on the tin, and a long list of missing components, including a new set of forks, would have to be found if Terry was going to complete this particular restoration. And so, as to begin the bike's rebuild, a full list of what was missing and what other parts just needed refurbishment was then drawn up by Terry, although naturally there was one big plus with this new resto venture, in that most of the bike was now already in bits, so there wasn't much to do with regards a teardown. But Terry did start with the bike's chassis, and he checked it out for any signs of damage or wear, and I think he did sort out quite a few minor repairs on the frame before then sending it out to be stripped of its old patina before then having it repainted in this Cagiva red. And as you'd expect, many of the other parts that were bolted onto the frame, like the rear swing arm and the bottom fork sliders and the bike's centre stand and rear shock springs and rear brake torque arm, were all given that self-same treatment before being reunited with their particular part of the bike's chassis, which, as you can see, is now looking almost as good as new once again. But I certainly do remember Terry telling me that he wasn't that sure if this was actually the correct length of centre stand for this bike, because he thought that it was a lot longer than it should be, and it was certainly on his to-do list to try and correct it. But this part here was what actually came with the bike, so maybe the seller didn't have the correct part fitted to the bike originally. But because this is the RX Enduro model, I think these bikes were fitted with a centre stand at Cagiva HQ in 1981, although this part here wouldn't have been fitted onto the motocross model in that year. But I suppose you could still take this centre stand off the bike and then just use it as a scrambles or weekend motocrosser. And as you're no doubt aware, the Cagiva's chassis and this swing arm were made of chrome moly steel, as were many of the other European chassis of that period. And although the combined weight of this frame, swing arm and some of the other smaller chassis items did add unnecessary kilograms of weight to the bike, the frame and swing arm was still super strong, and it did have very little in the way of flex, so these parts could certainly take quite a lot of abuse while these bikes were being raced on the track. But as I said, once the frame was all stripped bare and repainted and then rebuilt with all of the other chassis bolt-ons, Terry was certainly well pleased with how this part of the bike's resto had turned out. So he could now concentrate on the engine and a few of the other components that go into making this particular Italian stallion. So, as I remember from the 1980s, these piston port two-stroke Cagiva engines were pretty decent off-road motors, as I recall, and I'm quite sure that these 250s, I think they had a bore of around 72 millimeters, and I think it was a stroke of, I think it was about 61 millimetres or thereabouts. And generally, these engines did make a decent amount of power and were quite reliable as well. And as we take a look at some of the components bolted on to this 250 engine, now to supply the premix fuel to the 250 cylinder, I think it was a 36 millimetre Italian made Delorto carburetor, and this one here certainly appears to be the self-same one that was fitted to the bike back in 1981, and you can see that it's secured onto the cylinder intake and at the rear onto the airbox by a pair of flexible rubber hoses and a couple of worm drive clips. And again, the airbox on the Cagiva was of course made of plastic, which again was around the time that more and more off-road bike manufacturers were beginning to turn from the heavier steel or alloy parts on their motocrossers to this much more lighter and less expensive to produce plastic parts. But inside this airbox here was a foam type filter that was quite easily accessible from underneath the bike seat, where you could then remove and wash it in solvent and then re-oil it before replacing it back in the airbox. And as we move down onto the sparks ignition part of the engine, and because this was of course the early 1980s, the old contact breaker points ignitions of the past were now long gone, and in its place behind this cover we had a CDI electronic magneto type sparking unit, which I think was a motoplat system, which was more or less what produced the sparks on some of the German Micos of this same year. But again, these relatively modern ignition systems were better and much more reliable than those older contact breaker ignitions that we just mentioned. And I also remember that little round part there on the centre of the cover, I'm sure had a 250 sticker on it when the motor was brand new, but you could never seem to get these little stickers to stay on this part of the engine, and it was usually one of the first things to drop off the bike after it being around the track. Now, with regards to the transmission side of our 81 Cagiva, we've got a wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch behind this casing here, comprising of a series of steel and cork drive plates. And to connect the transmission and the crank together, I think it was a helical gear on the end of the crankshaft that connected the clutch basket to the engine, which is a much more reliable and efficient way of joining gearbox and motor together, rather than using something like one of those old rattly primary chains that you used to find on the old Micos back in the day. Now, of course, my aging memory isn't what it used to be, but I'm pretty sure that these old Cagivas had a 5-speed gearbox, although if that's not the case, then of course feel free to correct me in the comment section at the bottom of your YouTube player, because there's always the chance that this Enduro version maybe had a different type of transmission from the motocross or MX model. And of course, to get our 250 Cagiva engine fired into life, it was usually just a few swings on this little kickstart that was needed to get that Cagiva motor up and running. And this kicker here was one of the folding variety, so once that engine was running, it could then easily be tucked neatly away. But you can also see that these Cagiva engines had these rubber insulators between the cylinder's cooling fins to try and dampen down some of the vibrations from the fins when the motor was running at full pelt, and reducing the vibes would of course in turn reduce some of the noise that was being produced by the fins movements. But these two-stroke Italian engines were certainly well suited as a scrambles or enduro power source, and once more this motor here was completely stripped and then rebuilt using all brand new bearings and seals and many new parts that Terry sourced not only from Italy but from much further afield in the USA as well. Although when it was all done and dusted, this RX250 engine is now probably as good, if not better, than it was the day it came from the factory. Now, during the refurbishment of our Bitsa Cagiva, one of the parts that needed very little attention was the bike's expansion chamber exhaust system, which, despite our Italian Stallion being 43 years old, this pipe here and its tailpipe were still in very good original condition, because as you can see, it had very little signs of any damage after its years on the track. So this was just a basic simple fix for Terry, with just a quick rub down to remove the old paint and then a freshen up with some nice high temperature matte black. And you can also see here at the back end of our exhaust system that our bike still has its original and virtually unblemished rear tailpipe silencer, which is ever so slightly different from what would have been the motocross version of our Cagiva racer, because I suspect that the motocross part of this exhaust would have been much smaller in size and maybe had a bigger exhaust outlet. But unlike, of course, these two small holes in this tailpipe, which I'm assuming is to do with the road-going decibel levels and the motorcycle laws that this enduro bike will come under if it ever takes to the highway. Now, as you learned at the start of this video, this bike did initially come with a set of forks, which were, of course, broken at the axle castings, so these were only good enough for the scrap heap. So Terry then had to scour the internet for a pair of replacements, and he did manage to find a pair over there in Cagiva land in Italy. So these replacement Marzoccis were again dismantled and then fully refurbished. Although, having said that, for the 1980s, these Marzoccis were still among some of the best suspension systems of their day, which is why they were so popular and used on a multitude of different motorcycles across Europe during that period. And I suppose that if you were to compare these to modern day motocross suspensions, they'd be probably looked upon as just basic and nothing particularly special. But 40 odd years ago, these Marzoccis were certainly a decent bit of kit. And from the front end of the bike, we make our way onto the rear suspension department, where we've got a pair of what looks like they could be the original shocks for our 81 Enduro off-roader, although at the time I took these clips of the bike, Terry never actually said that if that was indeed the case, or what manufacturer actually made them. But they could possibly be maybe a pair of Italian Marzoccis, or even the old Corticoso units, but they did certainly have a pair of remote gas and oil reservoirs that were tucked in behind both of those rear number plates. But regardless of what make or model of shocks these are, you can see that like the rest of the bike, they do look like brand new items. So I expect that these have also been stripped, rebuilt, and then repainted to fit in with all of the other refurbished bits and pieces that go into making up our Italian Cagiva off-roader. And when you take a look at the bike from the rear, you can see that those shocks certainly look the part and look period correct for a 250 RX Cagiva from 1981. Now, also in the early 1980s, we still had the old school drum and brake shoe stoppers on our enduro and motocross racers, because modern style hydraulic disc and caliper brakes were still a couple of years away as yet. But having said that, these antique drum brakes that were fixed onto our Cagiva, and of course many other motorcycles of its day, still did quite a good job of slowing or stopping these bikes in full flight. But then again, for their time, there wasn't really any other alternative to this, so this is really what you had to work with in terms of motorcycle braking technology. And while we're here hovering in this particular area of the bike, both of the front and the rear wheels on our Cagiva are a pair of gold anodized Acront alloy rims, and these were all rebuilt and then relaced onto the bike's original hubs with a brand new set of heavy duty stainless steel spokes. And returning to the back end of the bike, where you can see we've got quite a sizable rear sprocket there on our 250, probably picked so as just to get the gearing absolutely correct for doing enduros or motocross. Although I think when this bike ever takes to the highway, I don't think that you'll get much in the way of top speed with a sprocket this size. So I suspect that Terry's configured the bike to be used for off-road only. But moving upstairs onto the bike's fuel tank, you can see that this has now been totally restored from the condition that it arrived in when it was sitting on that pallet, along with all of the other dismembered parts, which, as you can see, was not in a very good condition, with most of the paint and the graphics all faded. But nevertheless, Terry soon worked his magic, and he had the old fuel cell looking like brand new once again. And back in 1981, I'm pretty sure that this alloy fuel tank held just over 2 gallons of gas and oil premix. So I suspect that if you were taking part in an enduro or even a scrambles event, then our Cagiva tank should certainly hold just about enough fuel to keep that 250 engine ticking over. But no question, Terry's still done a fantastic job on this tank to get it back to this kind of condition. But then again, that's nothing new to the likes of Terry, because he does perform these kind of transformations on a regular basis. And next to the fuel tank, of course, we come to the restoration of the bike's seat, which, to be fair, wasn't in that bad a condition considering the bike's age. But Terry, being Terry, during a refurb or restoration, everything has to be as near as he can get to being perfect. So this seat here was treated to a brand new cover, because the actual seat base and the foam insert were still in almost perfect condition. So there was absolutely no need to swap those parts for brand new ones. So as we now make our way onto the bike's bodywork and all of its plastic parts in particular, which, as you've probably already guessed, are all new replacement items, which I'm guessing are reproduction parts, because I do know that Terry had to source many different parts from Italy and the USA to complete this bike, although he never actually told me the source of these plastics. But thankfully for us, there are now a few companies out there that still specialise in reproducing these plastics for old classic bikes, so it makes you actually wonder where we'd be if we couldn't replace our old and broken and faded bodywork on our vintage bikes. Although, having said that, I certainly do have a friend who now can take your old original dirt bike plastics and then put them through a restoration process, which can then bring them back into this kind of condition, which is quite a good thing if you happen to have a bike that has super rare plastics that are no longer available, and if you need the originals brought back to life. But you can see that our Cagiva here certainly appears to have the correct mudguards on the front and at the rear, with the proper Cagiva logo there on the front as well. But both of the bike's side panels are again brand new, just like the rest of the bike's plastics, and I think the only part that Terry has yet to add to these side panels are the yellow number ovals that would have been added to these parts when it left Cagiva HQ back in 1981. So as I said, it's still quite good that we can access parts like these for our old race bikes, because otherwise, if we were in the middle of doing a refurb or restoration on our old classic machine, then we'd probably then have to make do with the scruffy originals. So as we make our way into the business end of our Cagiva RX, we've still got the bike's original set of handlebars there, with that crossbar welded on as it would have been back in 1981. And although the bike's clutch and front brake and throttle cables are all new replacements, Terry's still kept the original switchgear to operate the Cagiva's lights should the bike ever take to the King's Highway. And also incorporated into that switch block, although you can't see it in this particular shot, is an engine kill switch, just in case there should be any kind of issues with that Cagiva engine and it needs to be shut down in a hurry. But you can see the handlebars also have their original Magura alloy levers in place, with their rubber lever covers as well. But it's quite a rare thing to see a 43-year-old dirt bike that still has its original handlebars and levers, and many riders by now would have swapped these for much more modern parts. So again, more authentic components that are fitted onto Terry's bike. And so, as you can see from what was initially not really a fully built and functioning motorcycle at all, but just a pile of broken and dismantled Cagiva parts that were sitting on a wooden pallet, to what is now an almost factory fresh 81 RX250 Italian Enduro bike. And although this motorcycle wasn't exactly what Terry had ordered when he first bought it, he still made a fantastic job of putting the bits and all the other pieces back together, which I have to say is very typical of the quality and the time and the workmanship that Terry puts into each and every one of his projects. And I suspect that Terry will certainly make good use of this Italian stallion if he ever fancies doing a vintage enduro or maybe a classic scramble. And in between times, this bike here will still take its place alongside many of the other rare machines in his collection. But it's thanks to Terry's passion and his bike building skills that yet another rare and iconic old school off-road motorcycle's been saved from certain oblivion. Okay, so coming up next here on my CDB TV channel, we're going to continue taking a look at some of the machines from Terry's collection. And next up, we'll be having a look at this lovely 1981 Can-Am. So this will be our next featured bike here on my channel. So if you're not already subscribed, then I do hope you will do that very small thing, or even at the least return to take a look at this bike. But until the next time, it's goodbye for now.